Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Prasad Krishnamurthy. I'm a professor of law at the UC Berkeley School of Law, and special thanks to the Berkeley Center for Law and Business for sponsoring this event, and to Dean Chemerinsky. So I'm delighted to be speaking today with David Leonhardt of the New York Times about his new book, Ours Was the Shining Future. David, I think it's fair to call this book an ode to the American dream. You point out that the phrase American dream was first used by the historian James Adams in 1921. Adams spoke of, quote, that American dream of a better, richer, and happier life for all our citizens of every rank, which is the greatest contribution we have as yet made to the thought and welfare of the world, unquote. Those are large words. Adam ended his book by quoting an immigrant author, Russian-American Mary Antin. And her phrase was, "Mine is the shining future." And you take that phrase to be the title of your book. And so my first question is, can you talk a little bit more about the motivation for this book, how you traced the American dream through 100 years of history, and even pursued it into questions of contemporary social scientific study?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you all for coming out. I've been going around talking about the book all over the country since October, and it's particularly nice to be here talking about it because the University of California is an institution that has meaningfully contributed to the American dream. I talk about it a little bit in chapter 10. And so what I find so striking about that definition of the American dream that James Trussell Adams offered is that he offered it in the Depression. Right? He writes that book in 1931, and it's the depth of the Depression at that point. And he talks about this dream of a better, richer, happier life for all of our citizens of every rank. And as Prasad said, he says that it's the United States' greatest contribution to the world. And it was a pretty audacious idea to offer in the midst of the Great Depression. And yet we know in hindsight that it very much became true over the next several decades. Obviously, the United States had terrible problems in the 30s and 40s and 50s and into the 60s. But it's also the case that people's lives really meaningfully became better over that period. And so what I really wanted to do was try to explain, how is it that people's lives became better? How is it that income for a median family rose so much? We all think of economic inequality almost like gravity, that it's always, it has to go in only one direction. But actually, economic inequality was falling in the 30s and 40s and 50s. The racial wage gap, which at that point was between whites and blacks, because more than 95% of the country was white or black, was declining in those decades, even before the civil rights movement. The life expectancy gap between whites and blacks was declining in those years. Life expectancy was rising for all groups. It was rising even more rapidly for Black Americans than for white Americans. And so we really did construct a society in which people could expect to have their lives improve. If you were born in 1940 in this country, there was a 92% chance that you grew up to make more money than your parents did. And so obviously that is not really the way we feel now about our economy. People are much darker about it. They're much more anxious about it. And so what I wanted to do was write a book that traced the story of how we had created that old economy. And we're not going to go back to that economy, but what are the lessons from it for today?
So in the time that we have, I'm going to ask you about the different historical periods that you discuss, and ask you to reflect on how they continue to influence our present moment. And I'll continue for the time of the talk, but then David is very eager and willing to answer questions after the talk. We'll just move the conversation into the hall or perhaps outside, because it's beautiful outside today. But let me start with the early 20th century. You speak of the accomplishments and the limitations of the progressive movement in the early part of the 20th century. And my own reading of your book was that I thought that the progressives maybe deserved a little more credit. So I'll ask you about whether you would agree with the following statement. So would you agree that that era made possible the liberal imagination of the New Deal that followed and the modern administrative state? For example, you have a very nice biographic treatment of FDR's Secretary of Labor, Fannie Perkins. And when Fannie Perkins took her job as Secretary of Labor under Roosevelt's administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, what she asked him to let her enact was a plan of public works, a minimum wage, disability pay, an 8-hour day, workplace safety, unemployment insurance, and retirement benefits. Really the modern welfare and administrative state. And did that not come from progressive activists of an earlier era who sought to make that come about? So that was my first question on that score. And then related to that, well, let me pause there so I don't ask multiple questions.
So I think the progressive movement deserves enormous credit, but I also think it had a major limitation. It had more than one major limitation, but one I want to focus on today because I think it's relevant to what we would call lowercase p progressivism today. The progressive movement of the early 20th century, before the Depression, before the New Deal, did accomplish, it had a lot of those ideas, and it accomplished a bunch of them. It passed child labor laws to prevent young kids from working really hard jobs. It pushed for the idea of minimum wage, which the Supreme Court largely shot down at that point, but would come back later during the New Deal. And so I think there's a lot of heroic history in the progressive era, but I think it was also very much a top-down movement. It was not a movement that was trying to give political power to ordinary workers, so much as it was a movement of experts, people like journalists and law students and professors deciding what was right for working class Americans and then trying to pass laws that would benefit them. And I think those kinds of top-down regulations and laws really can have enormous advantages. I think child labor laws and minimum wage laws are really important. But I think they're ultimately not enough. And the progressive movement was often relatively uninterested in asking poor and working class people, what do you want? What are your interests? And I think the really important change that happened in the New Deal was the New Deal involved much more grassroots political organizing by workers themselves through labor unions. And so you then not only have a situation in which you have laws that say children can't work, or workers can work only this number of hours a day, or you must get this minimum wage, but you had labor unions in which workers could effectively negotiate with their employers to get a higher wage. And I worry that today's version of progressivism is similarly top-down to the old capital P version of progressivism, in which it often doesn't listen to what workers themselves want. Sometimes it's relatively disdainful of workers who tend to have more socially moderate views than college graduates do. And so I think that there really are advantages in kind of a bottom-up movement in which people can be empowered to try to negotiate for pay increases on their own and form their own political movements, rather than having more privileged, affluent people tell them what is in fact in their interest. And that's why, although I think the progressive legacy is quite heroic, I also think it's worth focusing on its real downsides. And in a way, what you can summarize it with is the economy of the 1920s that came out of the progressive movement was still a really high inequality economy. And so the progressive movement had a much less success at producing mass prosperity than the New Deal did.
My other question on the progressive movement is, it relates to a theme that I kind of kept coming back to in reading your book, in that, in a way, some of the emphasis of political movements changed the way we talk about things, but that the prior history still exerts a kind of gravitational force. So that in a sense, we are kind of all New Dealers now, and we are in a way all neoliberals now. And for the progressive era, my observation, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, was that the progressive era started the modern administrative state, and the modern administrative state has never turned back. No matter what Ronald Reagan tried to do in the 1980s, in any decade or 20-year period in the United States since the progressive era, the number of federal agencies has increased. Probably the number of state agencies has increased as well. The number of federal regulations that bind firms and individuals has increased. The rule books have increased. The number of people whose job is compliance with those rules has increased, probably, certainly in numbers, probably also as a share of the workforce. And so the progressive era also kind of unleashed the state in a way in which we don't know the limits of its growth. Do you agree with that kind of characteristic of that era and the trend that it sort of set forward?
That's a really thoughtful way of thinking about it. I think I would partly agree. I think that it is the case that we often build on what happened in earlier eras rather than going back to a world before they existed. And so, as you note, Ronald Reagan didn't actually eliminate huge numbers of federal agencies. He didn't really eliminate any. But I do think things change over time. And I think Reagan, for example, is really an inflection point. I mean, tax rates have never returned to their pre-Reagan era. Antitrust law and the idea that the US government would allow companies to get really big underwent a fundamental change in the 70s and 80s. And so, you can do similar things for overall regulation of Wall Street. I mean, there are, in terms of the government's approach toward labor unions, there are a whole set of things that really changed in a fundamental way in the 30s. And then changed partly back in a meaningful way in the 1980s. I mean, you look at the top federal tax rate, it was 90% in the 50s. Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican president. He didn't do anything to lower it. Richard Nixon kept a very high top marginal tax rate. And then Reagan came in and lowered it. And we've never gone back to those pre-80s thing. And so I do think we build off the past, but I also don't think we're prisoners to the past. And so you mentioned that we're all neoliberals now. I think we're less neoliberals than we were a decade ago. I think Joe Biden is the least neoliberal president we've had. It's a little bit hard to think about Donald Trump, but I think Joe Biden is clearly the least neoliberal president, setting aside Trump, in decades, right? Certainly since Reagan. And so is he FDR? No. Is he Eisenhower? No. But he also represents a shift, I think, in part because of a lot of people have looked at the results of the neoliberal era and said, hey, the neoliberal era has not delivered on its promises to most Americans. We were told if we allow global trade to flourish, if we shrink unions, if we allow companies to become bigger, if we regulate businesses less, it'll bring prosperity for everybody. And it hasn't, nor has it brought freedom, democratic freedom to China. And so a lot of the promises of the neoliberal era have just proven to be false. And I think that explains why there's some of the revisiting of those ideas. They're not gone, but we also don't just accept them.
So one of the weaknesses of the progressive era you point out in the book, and you mentioned it today, was a failure to build a broad working class movement. And that the 30s were a real inflection point as this began. And David has an arresting account of labor organizing in Minnesota in the 1930s, which illustrates the great risk and sacrifice that was part of participating in the labor movement, in both for the workers themselves, but also for their families, potentially for their relatives. And I think this is something that comes out of any reading of 20th century labor history, is the enormous risk and sacrifice that was part of that movement. And then you document many of the successes of the labor movement from the 1930s to the 1970s, the rise in unionization, the wage premiums that unions were able to gain, the increases in benefits that were part of that, and then also the spillovers from what unions had gained in the union workplace to other parts of the employment workforce where employers had to keep up and keep pace with what the unions were offering. And then you also recount the beginnings of a decline starting in the late 70s and then over the course of the early 80s. So the question is, what do you think were the key factors that explain this arc of the labor movement over the 20th century, both the successes of the mid-centuries, but then also the, what might call it, the institutional failures that led to now the workforce is maybe 11% unionized, and there are no signs of any widespread increase over at least the near horizon.
Part of my argument in the book, in some ways it's the biggest argument, is that grassroots political movements in this country are more powerful than many people realize. I think a lot of people think of the system as no longer working or being rigged, or we can't change it, or money in politics makes it impossible. And I actually think that there's this incredibly proud, heroic history of grassroots movements in this country for changing the country. The labor movement is an example. The labor movement of the 30s and 40s. Then we have the civil rights movement. We have the women's movement. We have the disability rights movement. If all of those are too old to resonate and you say, yeah, but the time was different then, I'm old enough to have remembered when we didn't think marriage equality was something that was going to happen, certainly not with the speed that it did happen. That was a grassroots movement, marriage equality was. And although I'm just going to guess that I'm in a setting where the Dobbs Supreme Court decision is not all that popular, that was a grassroots movement. The political right in this country did not react to Roe v. Wade and the fact that it felt totally powerless in our judicial system by saying the system is rigged, there's no hope. They organized. And they basically took over the Republican Party, and they won local elections, and they made sure that the Republican nominees were people who would appoint judges who opposed abortion. And even though they never even had 51% of the country on their side, they had this massive grassroots movement that overturned the law and changed the law. And we see smaller recent examples on the left, the effort to prevent Trump from repealing Obamacare, even though he had the votes. That was a grassroots movement. The fact that purple states and even red states have expanded Obamacare and raised the minimum wage, those are grassroots movements. And so I think the labor movement fundamentally succeeded because it followed the path that I think every successful grassroots movement has followed, which is both an outside game and an inside game. The outside game is you organize huge numbers of people. And the inside game, and you also try to persuade Americans of the righteousness and rightness of your cause. And the inside game is you try to elect politicians who agree with you and who will change the law. And both of those were necessary for the labor movement's success. Both the fact that thousands upon thousands of workers joined unions, and then the fact that they elected a pro-union governor in Minnesota, it's the story I tell, who didn't crush the strike, a pro-union governor in Michigan who didn't crush the auto workers strike, and a pro-union president in Franklin Roosevelt who didn't use the power of Washington to basically constrict labor, but to help it. And so I think that is fundamentally the story of the rise of the labor movement. And I think the story of its fall is multifaceted. I think labor got fat and happy. And the people running American labor in the 60s cared a lot less about attracting new members and cared a lot more about trying to protect the gains of their existing members. They made a fundamental miscalculation. Without attracting new members, the gains of their existing members were also going to be vulnerable. They didn't do enough to try to recruit women. They didn't do enough to try to recruit immigrants. And then there was a very conscious assault on labor on the part of both corporate America and on the part of Washington starting in the 80s. And so I think the good news is if you believe that labor is as important to workers' wages as I do, and I don't think labor unions are perfect. I've been in a labor union. I found it hugely frustrating at times. I tell that story in the book. I'm now a manager at the New York Times. There are ways in which I find the labor union at the Times frustrating now. But here's the way I would think about it. Labor unions are flawed, but so are corporations. And if you have deeply flawed corporations going unchecked by flawed labor unions, you end up with an economy like ours, really high inequality. And so I think the good news is our government actually hasn't tried very hard to make it easier for people to join labor unions. Biden hasn't enacted labor law reform. Obama didn't enact labor law reform. Bill Clinton didn't enact labor law reform. No Republican has enacted it. Jimmy Carter had to choose between prioritizing the Panama Canal Treaty and labor law reform. He picked the Panama Canal Treaty. LBJ, famously the most successful president at getting Congress to do what he wanted, there was only one part of the Great Society that he didn't get signed into law, labor law reform. And so I really do think it's possible that changes in labor law would make it easier for Starbucks workers and Amazon workers and other workers to join unions. But I think it's going to take some kind of grassroots movement like the kind we have seen in the past, and probably an updated vision of what a labor union should look like today, rather than simply trying to mimic the labor unions of 90 years ago.
If I can kind of continue along those lines, how would you respond to the following in terms of an important factor in the weakness of American political unions and their decline? One view would be that they were not sufficiently melded and made part of the administrative state, so that whereas in the 1950s, probably the nature of union bargaining across German and American unions wouldn't have looked that different in the outcome. There were like 3 or 4 important American automobile manufacturers. You would have pattern bargaining across each of them. So the union would strike a deal with GM, they'd strike a deal with Ford, and so on. And those deals would look roughly similar, but they were done on a kind of firm by firm basis. Whereas in Germany, for example, it would have been done in a sectoral way, and with the government and the unions and the firms all kind of participating in each, in a way, balancing the interests of the others. Whereas it was the state played a much lesser role. And so as the industrial structure of the United States changed, as automobiles became less important part of the economy, the unions grew weaker, just as their kind of paired industry grew weaker. But there was no force in a way saying like, well, all auto workers are going to get the same deal, or all workers in service part of the economy are going to get the same deal. And so to what extent do you think as you say, the fact that government was never on board with the unions, they never passed, this legislation that could have created a more corporatist vision. How much do you think that played a role in this decline?
I do think it played a role. And I think it's not a coincidence that when you see some of the people who are trying to think about what modern unions should look like, they think about sectoral bargaining, right? So that rather than having to go and organize each individual work site and have an incredibly protracted fight at each one, maybe you change the law in a way that when you get a certain number of workers to sign up, the entire sector, say the warehouse sector, could bargain. There are complications with all of these, but I think there is something to that, which is that unions in this country have had to fight so hard on each individual work site to organize. It's so expensive. It's so difficult. Companies can often wait out the workers. They can find excuses to fire the workers, as Starbucks has long done. We'll see whether the new CEO he has signaled that he might be taking a less aggressive approach toward unions at Starbucks. But when it's work site by work site by work site, often companies just have enormous advantages. And I do think that some of the sectoral approach can be important. I would just add one thing. We all agree that our economy is shifting to become more of a service economy, right? That is a truism at this point, and it's correct. I think we often don't think about how actually that should create some more space for unions to operate in our economy. In a manufacturing economy, there really is a risk that if a factory unionizes, the company is going to decide to move to a non-union state or move to a low-wage country in the South or in another hemisphere in order to escape the unions. And they can still make the same products they were making and then ship them. But service businesses can't do that. The Starbucks 4 blocks from here can't move to Alabama or can't move to Vietnam and still serve Berkeley students their lattes. The Amazon warehouse distribution center in Oakland or San Francisco or down in Silicon Valley, wherever it is, I assume not San Francisco, at least not downtown, given real estate costs. That Amazon distribution center, if it unionizes, Amazon can't move that distribution center to rural Missouri and still have it serve the Bay Area. It just doesn't work. And so in an economy that becomes increasingly service, that has more restaurants, that has more hospitals, that has more big warehouses, it actually theoretically should be easier for unions to organize. And so I think we sometimes think about all the ways in which unionization is harder today than it was in the past. And there are some of those ways. But there are also some ways in which they actually should be more feasible and easier. And I do really think that economically, we can have a strong labor union today. The hurdles are more political than they are economic or theoretical.
I agree. I would point out a number of Western European countries have unionization rates that are close to 60%, and that many of them have kept those in their manufacturing sectors as well. You point out there are many opportunities for unionization in services. Even with the greater advent now of industrial policy at the national level, I think there also becomes greater opportunities for creating a national strategy around industries that involves a national bargain between labor and capital with respect to how things should be done. So I think there's greater scope both in the services and in manufacturing, and then the question really, as you say, is political. Speaking of an important political part of that equation, you write of changes in the mid-century with respect to the culture of businesses, and I think this is particularly interesting for us here at a Berkeley Center for Law and Business talk, and among students who may either themselves rise to these positions within corporations or be important advisors of corporations in this capacity. And you say that in the 1950s, the corporate elite of the United States really changed their attitude to labor and to government, and changed from an attitude of confrontation to more accommodation. And you tell the story of Paul Hoffman, the CEO of Studebaker, as someone who not only made that change, but then tried to convince the other corporate leaders in the country that this was the direction to move in. So what do you think accounted for this shift? What is the explanation for that? And then do you think similar forces could play a role today as we debate the stakeholder approach to corporate governance, or ESG, which is environmental and social and governance perspectives on the decisions that firms could take? How do you think that prior history can or can't inform the present?
I think the main thing that explains the old change is fear. I think America's corporate leaders were deeply afraid that our society was coming apart, and the things that they relied on to run successful businesses and make profits and have a good life themselves were at risk. And so if you go back to the 1930s, the US is in a depression. Both fascism and communism appear to be on the march in Europe, depending on what parts of Europe. It was not crazy to think that there could be truly radical movements in this country. There were some of those movements. They never became huge, but there were both fascist and communist movements in this country. And business leaders were really worried about it. And so Paul Hoffman was not a liberal. He was a Republican. He worked for every opponent Roosevelt had when Roosevelt was president. He was the CEO of Studebaker for the part of the book that I tell. He grew up in Chicago. He moved out to LA. He was a very successful car salesman. He opened some of his own car dealerships selling Studebakers. He was so good at it that Studebaker hired him and brought him back to corporate offices, and he ultimately rose up. And he looked at things and he said, oh my goodness, I'm worried that American capitalism isn't delivering the goods to our people. And we need to prove that basically American capitalism is a better system for workers than the alternatives that they're trying in Europe. And he basically went on an evangelical tour, a barnstorming tour, during the war, when he tried, just before the war started and then right after the war started, trying to persuade American executives that they could have a high-wage, high-profit model rather than the low-wage, high-profit model they had had in the 1920s. And I don't mean to put it all on Paul Hoffman's shoulders. He's symbolic of a larger sense. But there really was a sense in corporate America. They still didn't like unions. They still thought Roosevelt's New Deal was too big. They still complained. But they didn't try to eliminate unions. They instead tried to do battle with them and not let them grow too big and not let them get too large wage increases, but they didn't try to crush them. And I think you really see the clearest evidence that this really was different when Eisenhower wins the presidency in 1952. In retrospect, we think of Eisenhower as the candidate of the military because he came out of the military, but Eisenhower was really the candidate of corporate America. His biggest backers were corporate executives. After he won the election, he went and he spent 2 weeks at Augusta National Golf Course picking his cabinet. And nearly everyone he picked in the cabinet was a business executive. And so Eisenhower was the Republican of corporate America. He's taking office as the first Republican president in 20 years. As I mentioned before, the top marginal tax rate is 90%. And what does Eisenhower do about the top marginal tax rate? Nothing. He leaves it in place. And so this really was a different attitude by business and by business's main political party, the Republican Party. They were much more interested in coming to something of a truce, of viewing workers as more of a loyal opposition rather than an enemy. Some of that's the Cold War. And so you really see from business a different approach, and it continues well into the 60s. I mean, why is Richard Nixon, for all his other weaknesses, such a moderate on economic policy? He's a moderate in large part because this accommodation between business and labor existed into the 70s. And then things break down so much in the 70s that it helps radicalize parts of the Republican Party and parts of business. And they basically come up with this idea that we have to attack government and attack labor in order to fix our economy's problems. And look, I understand why they came up with that diagnosis. The 70s really were quite problematic. But the policies they've put in place, they promised we're going to deliver better living standards for everybody, not just for CEOs and for investors. And they haven't. I mean, to me, the central statistic, it's the first chart in my book. In 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. You can look at the chart I put. It's kind of right in the middle with parts of Europe, Canada. We look normal, maybe a little bit below average, but normal. For the last 15 years, we have had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world, and it's not even that close anymore. We started trailing behind the growth in life expectancy of other rich countries in the early 80s, and we're now last by a lot. There is something about the American system that isn't working for most people right now. And so I don't know exactly how we reanimate that spirit that Paul Hoffman had and get our corporate elites to understand that parts of our system really aren't working and thus some things are at risk. But I think it's important that our business leadership begin to take a less self-centered, more patriotic approach than they have in recent decades.
If I can ask you about two potential contemporary forces that might push in that direction. One is potentially competition from China, because as you point out in your book, a lot of what was done in the 50s was under the shadow of the Cold War, thinking, well, we're now in a national competitive race and we need this cooperation from government and from workers in order to succeed. And this is a national mission as much as a selfish kind of corporate vision or an individualistic mission. So that would be one. And then two, the kind of contemporary unraveling of politics, right? The widespread disaffection that so many Americans have with the political system is also at least a potential force for corporate elites to think that they play a role in attempting to answer to that in some way. Certainly you see individuals speaking out, you see more conferences, you see more statements by corporate groups, but whether that would turn into any kind of concrete action, I just got posed as a question to you.
I do think the competition with China has the potential to have some good side effects for our politics and our economy. The Cold War had exactly that. Now, there are often real risks with a kind of national competition, right? There's a reason we still remember McCarthyism. There's a reason we remember the phrase, the Red Scare. There often is a level of paranoia with that. It often takes the specific form of ethnic targeting. During the Red Scare, it was particularly targeted at Jews. Today, you can imagine, and you've even seen some evidence of it being particularly targeted at Chinese Americans. And so I think we really want to be on guard about the downsides of that. At the same time, the United States and China represent fundamentally different visions of what our world should look like. I like the United States' vision, right? I like a world in which people can vote for their leaders, in which people can criticize their leaders. I like the United States' approach to individual rights on all kinds of things, how it treats people who are not straight, how it treats women, right? I mean, look at the Chinese political leadership. You'll look a long time before finding a woman who has a meaningful role in Chinese political leadership. So I think it's okay to say that there are real advantages to the American system, to democracy. And I do already think there are signs that the competition with China has had some depolarizing effects on American politics. They're modest, but they're still clear. Why is it that the semiconductor bill got bipartisan support? It was largely because China is one of the relatively few issues that Republicans and Democrats can occasionally agree on now. That is an echo of the bipartisan consensus during the Cold War. And so I do think there are aspects of the rivalry and the competition with China that can have positive domestic consequences. Patriotism can really be a force for progressive good. Is it possible that, your second question, that the breakdown of politics will lead to kind of more corporate leadership? I absolutely agree it's possible. I would also say I've seen scant evidence of any corporate leadership coming out of the chaos that we have now. I just haven't seen CEOs who are trying to create a more inclusive economy and who are trying to solve some of our polarization problems. I think most of it tends to be window dressing, right? I think a lot of the ESG stuff tends to be window dressing. Not all of it, but I don't yet see corporate figures who I say, oh, that person is going to help lead us to a different kind of an economy, the way that George Romney, who's another figure in the book, Mitt's dad, and Paul Hoffman, and the people around Dwight Eisenhower did 75 years ago.
So in the book, you point out that the universal programs of the New Deal and the Great Society often left out minorities, either through explicit carve-outs for domestic workers, when just domestic workers were disproportionately minority, or farm workers, when the same is true, or administrative federalism and discretion, where states would administer federal programs, and there would be a great deal of discretion with respect to who got the benefits. And those left out minorities even when they were eligible for the program. So given this history, and then given the hostility to race and group-based policies that is current on the Supreme Court, what does this history tell us about the ability of universalist programs to lower racial inequality going forward?
I think this history is really important, and I alluded to some of it earlier, but it's really important to remember that at the same time we had such terrible, virulent racism, state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans in the 1940s and 50s. As I mentioned before, the Black-white wage gap during that period was shrinking. The Black-white life expectancy gap during that period was shrinking. And so how could that possibly have been? And the main explanation is that the United States government was adopting a set of policies that were decreasing economic inequality. And by decreasing economic inequality, they decreased racial inequality. So when labor unions started, they were predominantly white, but relatively soon during World War II and after, they actually became predominantly Black, or at least that's the wrong word, disproportionately Black, right? Particularly for lower wage workers. A greater percentage of lower wage workers who were Black were in labor unions than lower wage white workers. And so even without policies to dismantle segregation, that is how we had declining racial inequality in these years. And in many ways, the most heroic figure in my book is A. Philip Randolph. To me, he's an example of someone who built grassroots politics. He is an example of someone who had much more reason to feel cynical about the political system than any of us do today, but he kept fighting and ultimately built this incredible movement. People remember him as a civil rights leader, which he was, but he was first a labor leader. He was able to become a civil rights leader because he was a labor leader. And so you had movements like that. You had the labor movement in particular. You had federal government policy that was trying to lift the wages of lower income workers, and that helped shrink racial gaps. That can never eliminate racial gaps. You can't eliminate racial gaps without going after specific racial inequities, but you can reduce racial gaps merely by reducing economic inequality. It also tends to be politically much more popular than race-based policies, right? I don't need to tell you all, affirmative action went down to pretty wide defeat, even here in California, whereas often policies designed to combat economic inequality are popular. I mentioned a couple before. Minimum wages pass even in red states. Affirmative action fails even in California. And so I think if people can focus on the fact that not only can policies to produce a more inclusive economy, not only are they a good idea on their own because they produce a more inclusive economy, but they also can reduce some of our racial gaps. I think that can be not but a very powerful way to decrease the racial inequities that we have in our society. A new kind of labor movement, or an expanded minimum wage, or other policies that reduce the cost of healthcare for lower income people, or reduce the cost of education for lower income people. Those policies would reduce racial gaps in the United States today because racial gaps exist in the United States today.
But let me push on this a little bit. I think one way of viewing the US's record on racial inequality from 1940 to 1960 is to say the United States reduced racial inequality in a fit of absent-mindedness, as in which was the old saying about how Britain acquired its empire. The policies didn't understand that that's what they were what they were doing and what the intended effect would be. But it happened anyway, largely because of the way that the economy was growing and the distribution of wages were being paid out. But for all the intentional policies to affect the economy, the Veterans Administration and the program for veterans to attend university, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration and the mortgage laws, the availability of mortgages to the population. All those were universal programs, but were administered in such a way as to exclude largely Blacks, but also other minorities. And so I think that creates, for many who are interested in the question of racial equality, a real skepticism about not a growing economy that might lift all boats, but about universalist programs that could be administered in unequal ways. An example would be Medicare expansion in the aftermath of the Obama. So Medicare was expanded by the Obama administration in such a way that states got to decide whether they wanted the expansion or not. And what were the states that decided not to get the expansion? It was the states that were disproportionately minority. And so I think this skepticism exists with respect to programs of that nature. And so I'm interested in your sort of thoughts on that and how we are to think about that kind of going forward.
Yeah.
For example, the minimum wage seems to be one policy that is, because of the way it's administered, that is kind of impervious or robust to these kind of implementation differentials.
I mean, I think it's important to fight to make sure that universalist programs actually are universalist rather than targeted at whites, right? And so I don't see recent examples of race-based programs that the US has adopted that should give us confidence that they are the route to a more equal economy, right? It's not that, oh, we adopted all these race-based programs in this area and they really worked and they were popular and they had a big effect. Instead, what I see is race-based programs that have a very mixed legacy and often don't have the political popularity to survive, affirmative action being a good example. And then I see universalist programs that are deeply imperfect for the precise reasons you just highlighted, right? However, over time, those universalist programs, we can use our political system to make them truly universal, right? Social Security is no longer a program for white people, right? And yes, it is true that some states that have large non-white populations resisted the expansion of Obamacare. Over time, Obamacare is moving in only one direction, right? So far, it is only expanding. It is expanded in a whole bunch of states, including states with substantial populations of color. And so I think the programs that have the best record are universalist programs, and people have to be constantly on guard for exactly the dynamic that you said, which is making sure that these universalist programs don't actually become programs geared for more privileged people and particularly for white people. But I don't see a successful alternative in which, oh, actually the path toward reducing inequities in our society is this other thing that we're just not, that we should be trying.
Another major economic transformation over the course of the period you survey was the increase in labor force participation by women, the largest single transformation of labor institutions in the United States and across all the developed world during this time. So this involved a change in the composition of the labor force, the type of work that men and women did, the structure and organization of households, and the raising of children. And it had, beyond economics, a profound impact on the culture of the workplace and the culture of the home. And so my question is, what were the broader political implications of this major economic and cultural change?
I think, first of all, we can't repeat the great entry of women into the workforce to lift family incomes, right? We had this huge rise in women's labor force participation, which was a one-time increase in the income of many American families because they went from having one earner to having two. We can't repeat that. So it was a one-time effect, and we basically need to look for other ways to do it. And I think it's an example of one of the things that has been really a failure of government and social policy over the last half century, which is, and this isn't just about two-parent families, it's also about one-parent families, which are much more common than they used to be. We don't have any kind of reasonable support for parents of young children. And the burden as a result falls disproportionately on women, and we should simultaneously work to reduce that. But in the meantime, we should also fix this problem because it will disproportionately help women. And one of the stories I tell in the book is a little bit about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's interest in this when she was less famous than she would later become as a law professor, and trying to think about how phenomenally important these family support policies are for gender equality. And it's another way in which the US stands out, not just from other rich countries, but from many other not so rich countries in terms of not really having a system that allows people to make a living and also take care of their kids. We just don't really have much of a system there. This is an area where I actually could see real potential for cross-class alliances on this, because while the problems are much harder for lower wage people than they are for journalists or lawyers, much, much harder, there's still real problems with our system for journalists and lawyers and other relatively privileged workers. It's phenomenally difficult in our society both to pursue an ambitious career and to be able to spend substantial amounts of time with your children when they are young. And if you look at the economic research on this, some of it is what helped Claudia Golden win the Nobel Prize in economics last year. I really recommend people look at this. What you now see is the pay gap between men and women often is not what it used to be. It's not men and women of the same experience and qualification being paid different amounts for the same work. What instead we see is these terrible gaps begin to open up right at the time that people are having kids and never close. And so that, in a kind of professional sense, is the biggest form of sexism that we have in the white-collar American economy today. It is the punishment that parents, which ends up being disproportionately mothers, pay for spending significant amounts of time with their kids. And so I do think that this is one of those examples of, if you asked me where could we and should we have grassroots movements that could try to change this country, coming up with some sort of system so it is possible for people both to pursue decent work and a career and also be involved parents strikes me as a kind of movement that we could really benefit from.
I note that Rishi Sunak was elected as Prime Minister for the Conservative Party in the UK, and he ran on a program of being the next Margaret Thatcher. And then the first thing he did in office was to pass a large childcare benefit for all UK families, showing you that many conservative parties now view this as an important part of their social conservative agenda, and that it could be in the future for us as well.
That's another good point, not just cross-class, but it should be something that can appeal to people across to cross political ideas. And there are all kinds of really, and I won't go too deep in this, really interesting technocratic questions. Like you want to make sure you design these programs in a way, you don't want to say to families, you can have 12 months of leave and either parent can take it, because it ends up that women will end up taking it. And so what some countries have done is they've basically created real incentives for men to take it as well. So if both parents, if only one parent takes leave, I'm making up the numbers here, maybe you get 6 months. But if both parents take leave, they can both take 9 months back to back. And you really try to create incentives for gender equality in the law. It's really, to go back and read some of the stuff that Justice Ginsburg was writing about this in the 70s, and specifically thinking about Sweden, is really fascinating.
That's something we could adopt here at the University of California. Now, I'll just mention David has excellent chapters on immigration and on education. I would like to ask him questions on both, but given that I think we are near the end of our time and we are here at a university, I wanted to switch more to kind of a retrospective on his career, because we have mostly students in the room who are looking forward to careers in perhaps the private sector, the public sector, or some combination, thinking and working on the issues that you discuss in your book. And so I'd like to just give you space to reflect on, your career in journalism. Surely your first job wasn't your ideal job, and how you kind of kept your shining future in mind and worked toward, getting to a place where you were writing about and working with the issues you cared about most.
Well, that's a fun question. Thank you. I mean, I was very fortunate to have good opportunities. My dad was a private school teacher. Actually, my dad was a public school teacher who got laid off from his public school job at the same time that I was really struggling at my public middle school. And my dad got a job at a private school, which, as some of you may know, pays significantly less than public school jobs. But they realized that I could go to the private school with him, and my parents would have to make the money work, but it would solve the problem of their wayward 8th grader, who was me. That was a school in New York called Horace Mann, which is a bizarre place. It's also the best 4 years of education I've ever gotten. And so, like many of you, I was very fortunate in terms of having career options. And so I want to just recognize that in telling this story. I think in many ways, I've always wanted to be a journalist. I was obsessed with sports journalism when I was a little kid. And so I was lucky also to find something that I knew I wanted to do. But when I'm back on college campuses, I think the two things I say that I've learned seeing my friends and peers and thinking about my own journey over the last 25 years is, it's really important to do something that matters to you. And that, I know, is a cliche, but I also can't tell you how many people I've seen who have real options mess that up. And I know in a setting like this, you're surrounded by kind of an infrastructure to help you get jobs. And it's really hard not to be drawn to the most prestigious version of those jobs, whatever that is. And if you actually want to do those jobs, great, go do them. But if you don't, I promise you're going to have to spend way too much time at your job that if you don't really enjoy it and it doesn't have meaning to you, if you pick something just because it's the easy thing that comes your way, you will end up regretting it in 9 out of 10 cases or 99 out of 100. My wife went to law school. All she wanted to do was go into nonprofit law. Everyone told her, you can't go into nonprofit law without first getting a job at a law firm. I don't mean this as critical of law firms. If you want to work for a law firm, by all means, go work for a law firm. My wife didn't. And my wife's really stubborn. And so she said, wait a second, why do I have to go work in a law firm to get a job in nonprofit? Can't I just get a job in nonprofit first? And it was really hard. And she got a lot of rejections. And she had to turn down jobs that would have paid more to get rejected for jobs that paid less. But she ultimately got a job. And I think there are ways to do that. And I would just encourage you all to realize that in many ways, things are not fair for your generation, like buying houses, but also coming from a place like this, you are empowered in a lot of ways, and you should go do something that you actually want to do, whatever that is. If it's working for a big law firm, great. If it's being a prosecutor, great. If it's being a public defender, great. But figure out what you want to do and have the confidence to go do it, because you spend too much time at work basically to do something that you don't enjoy. I love what I do. There are still mornings where I get up and I think, oh, I have to do that this morning. And I'm just really glad that I don't have that feeling like 4 times a week. I have it a couple times a month. And then the second thing I would say is I really would think about this family stuff that I mentioned. I didn't necessarily think of journalism as something that would give me the freedom to coach my kids' sports teams and be around for dinner every night. And some of it is that I didn't pursue jobs that wouldn't have allowed me to be home for dinner every night. I had a job for about 2.5 years where I could rarely be home for dinner, and it really rubbed me the wrong way. And so for those of you who are thinking about your career and don't yet have families, even if you don't know who your life partner is going to be, even if you don't know how many kids you're going to have, if you think you might, it is not too soon to be thinking about what kind of paths will allow you to do that. Because absent the kind of political and social movement I talked about, you are on your own for figuring out a life that will allow you to have both the family life and the career life that you want. And don't neglect that, because my third kid, my youngest kid, is getting toward the end of high school, and I really miss having little kids around, and I'm never going to have it again. And I'm deeply, deeply glad that I didn't take too many jobs that cost me time away from my kids. Sorry for the little preaching at the end, but